Bedside Tutorials in Critical Care with me, your host, Pat Nelligan. Methanol poisoning. In this tutorial, I'm going to discuss methanol poisoning, the importance of the osmolar gap in unmeasured anion acidosis, and the treatment for methanol poisoning. Let's start with a clinical scenario. Eileen is a 63-year-old female who was brought to the emergency room after being found confused and disorientated by her neighbour. She lives alone. When Eileen came in, she appeared initially intoxicated but became progressively more confused and her vision became blurry. Several hours later, she developed vague abdominal pain and started vomiting. In her background medical history, she's a history of metabolic syndrome and has been treated with losartan for her hypertension and atorvastatin for her hyperlipidemia. She lives alone, doesn't smoke, has never taken drugs, but she has had a significant increase in her alcohol consumption since COVID-19, an unfortunate problem that we're seeing a lot of these days. Her vitals were as follows. She was confused and disorientated and lethargic with a GCS of 10. Normothermic. Blood pressure 125/85. Her heart rate is 105, so she's tachycardic. And her respiratory rate is 22 breaths per minute, so she's a little bit tachypnic. Saturation 98% on room air. In terms of her labs, her full blood count is relatively normal. And on her plasma chemistry panel, the only major abnormality is a bicarbonate or total CO2 of 10 millimoles per litre. This represents a significant metabolic acidosis. Her liver function tests reveal relatively normal AST, ALT, and bilirubin. The blood gas demonstrates a metabolic acidosis that's partially compensated and a widened anion gap with a lactate of 2.3 millimoles per litre. So this is an acute metabolic acidosis with mild hyperlactatemia, a normal chloride with no evidence of ketoacidosis or currently acute kidney injury. So there must be other unmeasured anions present. In this setting, we do need to send another test, and that can be done on the chemistry sample that we've already sent. And that test is to check the serum osmolality. And then we can calculate out the osmol gap. Serum osmolality comes back at 326 milliosmoles per kilo. So let's calculate out the osmolarity. The serum osmolarity is twice the sodium plus the potassium plus the urea plus the glucose. And in this case, that's 140 plus 4.3 multiplied by 2. Remember, all the anions equals all the cations. You just double the cations. Plus 5.4, that's the urea in millimoles per litre, and 6.6, that's the glucose in millimoles per litre. If you use milligrams per deciliter, you'll need to do a different calculation. And if you do this calculation, the serum osmolarity is 300 milliosmoles per litre. So there's clearly an osmol gap. Osmol gap is the measured osmolality minus the calculated osmolarity, and that's 326 minus 300, and that gives us an osmol gap of 26 milliosmoles per kilo. And what that represents is particles that are in the bloodstream and in the extracellular space that are osmotically active. Each particle is a milliosmol. But we're not able to actually measure those particles with our routine labs. What are the causes of a widened osmol gap? Well, most commonly they are alcohols and toxins like methanol, ethylene glycol, isopropyl alcohol, ethanol, glycerol, and paraldehyde. But we also see all kinds of junk products that are produced during metabolic storms like diabetic ketoacidosis, or situations where there's hyperlactatemia or acute kidney injury where there's lots of stuff floating around. Normally we do actually measure the lactate on a blood gas, but you may not have done that in a routine chemistry panel. So any of these metabolic storms will produce lots and lots of junk products that will be osmotically active. And you will always see an osmol gap in acute kidney injury or DKA. You also see it with hyperproteinemia like myeloma, hyperlipidemia. And sometimes you'll see hyperlipidemia in the ICU in patients on a propofol infusion. Their triglyceride levels may be very high, and this will give an osmol gap. In this patient, we also sent a toxicology screen because we were concerned that there was something that she ingested that may have caused the problems that we've identified. And on the toxicology screen, we identified a methanol level that is really high, 60 milligrams per deciliter or 22 millimoles per liter. So this patient has methanol poisoning. Methanol is the simplest of all alcohols. It has a chemical formula of CH3OH, methyl alcohol. It's clear, it's odorless, and it's flavorless. It's been used traditionally in households for thinning paints and in cleaning products, and it's used in the chemical industry for a whole medley of other products. It's a really versatile chemical and fuel source. Indeed, small amounts of this particular chemical are present in the body, having been absorbed from the bowel following fermentation by gut bacteria. If you go into a hardware store, you may find it on the shelf. In many countries, it's known as methylated spirits, and it's dyed purple like this particular product. I think it's worth pointing out that not all paint thinners contain alcohol. Turpentine, on the left, is a natural solvent from the resin of conifer trees, and white spirit is a petroleum-based solvent. So these are not alcohols, but you may use them for the same reasons you'd use methylated spirits. I want to now talk about events that happened in Laos in 2024. Unfortunately, the adulteration of drinks with methanol and other industrial alcohols is a major problem in the developing world and in mass tourism locations. Backpacking around, for example, Southeast Asia is a rite of passage for adventurous young people, and in 2024 a group of teenagers and young adults were staying in a tourist hostel in Laos, and before going out for the night they were offered a free drink by the owner and staff of the hostel. Subsequently, 6 tourists died from methanol poisoning and dozens became critically ill and were airlifted to Thailand. In each case, they developed headaches and visual loss and then rapid multi-organ failure. The deaths included 2 Australian teenagers and 2 Danish women and a 56-year-old American. It seems that the source of the methanol was a local brand of vodka known as Tiger, and it was made in the factory on the bottom right. And I think it's fair to say if any of us saw this factory, we wouldn't be keen to drink the products that came from it. It is not clear whether the doctoring was deliberate or just due to complete incompetence. Regardless, methanol poisoning is an alarmingly common problem in tourist locations, and I would urge anybody who's traveling not to take anything unless they see a bottle of familiar spirits being opened in front of them, or just stick to beer or sodas. Methanol is extremely toxic. 25 mils, just 2 tablespoons of pure methanol is sufficient to cause death. Just 10 mils is sufficient to cause severe poisoning. Well, why is that? To understand why methanol is toxic, you need to understand how alcohol is metabolized. When we talk about alcohol, we're talking about ethanol, ethyl alcohol. This is gin, vodka, whiskey, beer, wine, all of those products. That's ethanol. And ethanol is ingested in the body, goes into the stomach, and then it passes into the liver, where alcohol dehydrogenase breaks it down to acetaldehyde. This is subsequently broken down to acetate by aldehyde dehydrogenase, and acetate is eventually converted into acetyl coenzyme A. And of course, this forms part of the Krebs cycle. So that's how energy is derived from alcohol. And ethanol is quite safe unless it's consumed to excess. Methanol uses the same metabolic pathways, but the intermediaries are not safe. It is converted to formaldehyde by alcohol dehydrogenase and subsequently converted to formate or formic acid by aldehyde dehydrogenase, and this is a highly toxic substance. Eventually, formate, formic acid, is broken down to carbon dioxide. In toxicology terms, formate derived from methanol poisoning is a big nasty. It inhibits mitochondrial cytochrome oxidase activity, inhibiting oxidative metabolism, causing tissue hypoxia. And that means the mitochondria don't work even if the saturation is 100%. This is similar to what happens with cyanide. Formate directly damages the optic nerve, causing visual disturbances and blindness, and it also damages the brain, causing injuries to the basal ganglia and subcortical white matter. In terms of diagnosis, formate is a strong anion. It will cause a metabolic acidosis with an increase in the anion gap. This is not a molecule that is routinely measured when we're doing serum chemistry. There is a reduction in the bicarbonate and an increase in the base deficit. The lactate itself may be high due to the stress response, and you need to be very careful that you don't misdiagnose lactic acidosis in this setting. The lactate will not explain that large anion gap. Unlike ethylene glycol, the lactate that you're measuring in this setting is always lactate. The patient will be tachypnic with acute respiratory distress. How do we manage this problem? Let's move on to the treatment for methanol poisoning. Much of the time you will not know that the patient has ingested this toxic chemical. They should be managed as you do all unstable patients following the airway breathing circulation paradigm. If the patient is comatose, they will need to be intubated. If they're shocked or acidotic, IV fluids should be given, preferably balanced solutions. There's a dual effect from this because it hydrates the patient, but also because the patient has a lot of fluid going through their system, it will promote renal clearance of methanol and its byproducts. There is an antidote for methanol poisoning, and that antidote is the same as the one we use for ethylene glycol poisoning, fomipazole. Fomipazole competitively antagonizes the alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme, inhibiting the production of formaldehyde and formate. The methanol is then gradually excreted by the kidneys, although one might wish to remove the product faster by using CVVHD, that's continuous renal replacement therapy, or intermittent hemodialysis, particularly if acute kidney injury has already occurred. Folate acts as a cofactor for the enzyme formal tetrahydrofolate synthetase, which facilitates the breakdown of formate to carbon dioxide, mitigating the toxic effects. The initial dose of fomipazole is 15 milligrams per kilogram IV as a loading dose, and then every 12 hours, 10 milligrams per kilogram intravenously is given. You can give fomipazole regardless of whether the patient is on renal replacement therapy. You can give it regardless of whether you actually know that the patient has methanol poisoning, because the stuff is harmless. And if you have a patient with a severe metabolic acidosis of unknown cause, for example, with relatively normal lactate or ketones, consider giving fomipazole to your patient. You can also give the patient sodium bicarbonate, magnesium, thiamine, etc. Renal replacement therapy is indicated for high methanol levels, more than 50 milligrams per deciliter, for severe metabolic acidosis, for evidence of neurological impairment, for visual disturbances. It's really effective because hemodialysis clears both the methanol and the formate, rapidly correcting the metabolic acidosis and preventing organ damage. And in our practice, we would immediately start renal replacement therapy on these patients. And in my view, if you're considering dialysis, just do it. What do you do if there's no fomipazole available? So if your friend is poisoned with methanol and there is no real healthcare available, meaning you can't get fomipazole, what do you do? In that situation, you need to give the patient ethanol. Ethanol competes with methanol for alcohol dehydrogenase. Ideally, it's given intravenously, and that would be vodka diluted in saline from 40% down to 10%, but if not, give it orally as tolerated. Of interest, many of the backpackers who were poisoned with methanol in Laos went out drinking to other establishments afterwards, and in addition to the methanol, they probably consumed a fair amount of ethanol, and that might have actually saved their lives. Regardless, if you're in a developing country and you suspect that yourself or your friends have been poisoned, call for healthcare as soon as possible and get yourself out of that situation. Alcohol poisoning should be considered in any patient with acute metabolic acidosis, a widened anion gap, and confusion with or without acute kidney injury. If you think that methanol poisoning is a possibility, start with fomipazole while you were waiting for toxicology. Consider early renal replacement therapy if there is any evidence of neurotoxicity, a profound metabolic acidosis, or the emergence of acute kidney injury. Just a few comments and some advice to finish this. If you're traveling to parts of the world where there is a problem with doctoring of drinks, bring or buy your own in shops. Do not drink clear alcoholic liquids. And by this I mean drinks that purport to be vodka. Vodka is odorless, colorless, and tasteless, so it's a very high risk liquid. So don't drink these unless you can see the bottle from which it's being poured and you're satisfied by its provenance. In general, I think you should consume fermented rather than distilled drinks, fermented drinks, beer, cider. Drink bottled water or sodas using brands that you're familiar with, and whatever you do, do not leave your drinks unattended anywhere, ever. I hope you're enjoying these tutorials. If you are, please subscribe on YouTube, leave me some likes and some comments, introduce me to some of your colleagues or friends, and follow my blog at ccmtutorials.org.